It is my great honor this afternoon to introduce Lucy Ferris. Some of you may know her from class. She is our writer in residence. And if you were lucky, you've had her for a workshop or have taken a course on the novel Cloud Atlas. But there are a few of us in this room who lead double lives, and we work both as teachers and as writers, and it's her writing that we are here to celebrate today. She's a nationally best-selling writer and is the author of 10 books. She's won awards from the NEA, from the National Booksellers Association, and the Faulkner Society. And her fiction and essays appear regularly in the New York Times, the American Scholar, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. The wonderful writer, Tom Perrott, has called Lucy a courageous and thought-provoking writer, and the novelist, Claire Massoud, has hailed her most recent novel, A Sister to Honor, which she'll be reading from today. And it's available to buy over there. She'll sign it and draw a funny picture on the cover if you ask nicely. Claire Massoud described this book as a rare achievement, and I couldn't agree more. It's a terrific book, and one of the many things that I admire in it, and what Lucy has done here, beyond the precise and evocative descriptions of Pakistan and Enright, which is a small liberal arts school in the Northeast where much of the action is set, beyond the expertly drawn squash sequences, beyond the ease with which she creates not only sympathetic characters, but terrifying ones. Beyond her uncanny ability to inhabit the headspace of multiple characters, so a squash coach, a young Pashtun girl in America for the very first time who falls in love, her fiercely honor-bound older brother, and a fanatically religious relative who comes to hunt them down. One of the things that I admire most deeply about this book is that it gives you one of the best feelings you can have as a reader. And it's that feeling you get when you open a novel and you know within a few chapters that you are in the hands of a writer who is an expert in and a lover of plot. This is a finely calibrated and coiled novel, one that hinges on the idea and definition of honor, and it gives you all the stuff you come to fiction for: good sentences, compelling characters, evocative setting, deep feeling, while still expertly staging a clash of cultures that comes to a thrilling resolution. What's that resolution? You gotta buy the book to find out. You're not gonna tell everybody, right? No spoilers? When I arrived at Trinity a year ago, Lucy, you were so welcoming. I was very scared, and you made me feel at home. So thank you for that. And I'd like to just take a second to say how nice it is to be up here introducing you in this very fine book. So please help me welcome Lucy Ferris.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Is this on? I don't care whether it is or not. I just don't know whether I should lean into it. Yeah, okay, it is. Okay, so thank you all for being here. I am so grateful to this institution, because without it, I don't think this book would have seen the light of day. It was research funds from Trinity College that allowed me to do a research trip to Pakistan, where I was actually able to get some of the questions answered that I needed to get answered in order to write the book. So it's a real privilege to be reading back on the campus that inspired the book and that helped me to get the research means to write it. The other thing I was thinking about when I thought it was going to be coming finally to read here is how fortunate I am to be writing and reading at such an exciting time in fiction. You know, we hear a lot that the death of the novel has been proclaimed ever since it was born, and we hear a lot about the straits that it's in, and nobody's reading, and nobody's buying books, and so on and so forth. But it is a tremendously exciting time with what's happening in fiction. Jim Shepard and Heidi Julovitz, who are going to be here later this semester, are two exemplars of that. I spent the summer reading what is now a tetralogy by Alina Ferranti. There's Kate Atkinson writing. There's David Mitchell, whose book Cloud Atlas even referred to. There's Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, whose name I just like to keep saying. There's Teju Cole. There's so many exciting people. Anybody want a reading suggestion? Just come talk to me, because there's just so much going on, and it's a privilege to be, however marginally, in the company of all these tremendous writers who are out there in the world. So I'm going to read a bit from various different sections of this book, mostly to give you a sense of the various points of view. I understand there may be a few squash players here in the audience. Okay, so I'll read a little of the squash. I never know how much tolerance audiences have for the squash, but I happen to like the squash part, so we'll read a little of the squash. And I'm mostly interested in giving you a sense of the ways in which these different characters come into the story. So I will not give you a whole lot of the plot, but I will give you something of the points of view that enter into the story. It is set, as Ethan said, mostly at a small liberal arts college that bears no resemblance whatsoever to Trinity College. It's set in the Berkshires of Western Massachusetts. It can't possibly be Trinity. But it is a small liberal arts college that happens to have a Cracker Jack squash team. What a coincidence. It's been described often. I'm glad you described it the way you did, because it is, in fact, a book about honor. I've been asked often, why did I write a book about Pakistanis? I don't look Pakistani, which is true. It's not a book about Pakistanis. There are Pakistani characters in it. But it's really a book about honor, and in many ways, it's a book about America, from my point of view. It begins with a chapter set in Pakistan, and I'll just read you a couple of pages of that to give you a sense of how the book starts. And you don't need to know very much, because it is the very beginning. Farishta, the main character here, is the mother of Afia and Shahid, about whom you will hear later. In the valley below Farishta's house, the mulberry trees clung fast to their leaves. When the sun rose over the eastern hills, they looked plated in gold, but as the wind lifted the dry leaves, they whispered like yellow-haired girls sharing secrets. Seated in a circle in the warm sun, the village women pulled stripped branches from the stacks piled up during the monsoon pruning. From these they made baskets they would use in the spring, when the trees had returned to flower and to fruit, and the dead leaves had scattered in the tall grass. Farishta was looking out from the hujra, the main room of the house. Her stepson, Khalid, lay sleeping on a charpoy, his injured arm dangling. His breath seemed to catch in his adenoids with a sound that gave her a prick of irritation, at which she felt ashamed. Soon her girls would be home from school. Her husband, Tofan, would take time from overseeing the harvest to fetch them and check quickly on Khalid, and then he would be off again. At that point, Khalid might wake. He would take from her a lunch of chicken wings and rice. He would ask where his father was. Slowly, she turned from the window, knelt by the charpoy, and touched her palm to his forehead. It had gone clammy. The fever had broken. Tonight, perhaps he would haul himself from the bed and make his way into the village to the internet cafe, where he drank tea and shouted at whatever political news he could find on the flat screens they lined up along the wall. Farishta didn't like to admit how much easier she breathed when he was out of the house. She stood, adjusting her dupatta. She was a compact woman of middling height, but her firstborn son, Shahid, stood head and shoulders above her, and she was now eye to eye with her 13-year-old Sobia. Even Afia, once the smallest and frailest of her children, could throw an arm around Farishta's shoulders. She smiled, thinking of Afia. Though Shahid still lit her heart brightest, Afia gave her the warmest hope. They were both half a world away, but not forever. In 2 months, there would be a wedding for Mariam, one of Tofan's cousins, and the women would all ask about Farishta's absent children. Afia, they would assure Farishta, would one day make a brilliant marriage to a doctor in Islamabad or a rising star in the army, and be one of the new women of Pakistan, bringing medical care to other wives and mothers while being one herself. If any female could manage such a thing with honor, it was Afia. As to Shahid, Farishta's eyes burned. He might not, she admitted to herself when she had moments alone, come back. In his letters, she could read the truth. He was becoming part of the West, comfortable among its gleaming towers and atomized citizens. Her husband, Tofan, still spoke of Shahid's returning with his business skills to help Khalid take over the farm. But that was a fantasy. Khalid would have the farm to himself, and he would fill it with his jihadi friends. And Farishta's old age, her daughters gone, would be spent among sneering men, not of her blood. She tried not to feel this way. She had been trying now for almost 20 years. So that's Farishta in the village of Nasirabad, which we'll get another glimpse at a little farther along. The next section I want to read to you is from the point of view of Shahid, who is at Enright College. But his parents have had the idea, Mariam's wedding, which you just heard referred to, is happening in late December. And so his parents have decided to bring their son and daughter back for the wedding, and as a chance to see if it might be time, perhaps, to have Afia engaged. There's also been a rumor at this point of a photograph that might have surfaced on a website, in fact, the website of Smith College, that shows Afia with her hand in a boy's hand. And this rumor, which has been spread by Khalid, has alarmed them somewhat. So the brother and sister are going back, and Shahid has come to talk to his coach about it. This is a somewhat longer scene. Waiting outside Coach Hayes' office the first week of December, Shahid drummed his foot on the tight carpet. He had the itinerary in his back pocket. The past 3 Januaries, he'd played the Tournament of Champions in New York with Coach Hayes at his side the week before spring classes began. It was a so-called amateur tourney, but the best in the world came to America for it, and he had the chance to see guys he'd played in the juniors, now struggling like him to figure out their next path to glory. This year, as luck had it, Afia could not leave Smith before December 22nd. Baba would not hear of a visit shorter than 2 weeks, and the championships were 4 days after New Year's. He loved squash. It was difficult to say why, to put the feeling into words, only to say that if he couldn't play squash, he wasn't sure how he'd live. He would miss this tournament, not that he had any chance of winning, but just for that pulse of life beating within its glass cages. He hadn't felt this way at first. It had been Uncle Omar's idea one weekend when he'd come to Nasirabad. Squash, Omar said to Baba. That's the sport for Shahid. We have a great training center right in Peshawar, makes champions. We're not the 2 greatest squash players of all time, Pashtun. That first week at Omar's home had been an experiment, a strange bed and a new routine, lessons with Coach Khan every morning at the Peshawar Sports Academy. But when he returned home to Nasirabad, Shahid hadn't been able to sleep at night for missing the din of the city. Cars had honked and people shouted inside his ears, their strange accents like distant music. The town of his birth had seemed arid and lifeless. Then he had taken the new squash racket Omar had given him and shanked the hard rubber ball around the high-walled courtyard by the grammar school. He lost himself in the movement of the ball, the way it came off all the walls, the angles and spins. It was like getting to know a person. If you sent him that way, he bounced up, over, and low on the back wall. If you sent him this way, he hit the corner and shot back to your forehand. The ball answered you back. It surprised you. It caught you from behind unawares. When Omar's BMW pulled into Nasirabad a month later, Shahid's bag had already been packed. His mother's eyes shone with tears. His father hosted the neighborhood for tikka. To the World Championships, they toasted. To the Olympics one day. Finally, the door to Coach Hayes' office opened. Margot, number 1 on the women's squad, was heading out. Coach patted her back, murmuring something. "Hey, Shahid," Margot said. "How was your Thanksgiving?" He rose. "I got caught up on work. Coach fed us turkey." "I hear that's quite a feast," Margot said to Coach Hayes. "Can I count as an international student next year?" "You and everyone else from New York," Coach said. Shahid exchanged grins with Margot as they passed. He'd have liked to have her at Coach's Thanksgiving, because she'd have made Afia feel less alone. The other guys, Afran, Chander, Carlos, were all from countries where people knew how to keep a respectful distance, which was good. Still, Afia had spent most of her time in the kitchen, helping Coach's husband, or on the floor, playing with Coach's 3-year-old daughter, Chloe. She said she enjoyed it, but Shahid thought she'd rather have been with her Smith friends. That had been a stroke of genius. He admitted to himself with a nice dollop of pride, finding Smith College for her. After she took her O-levels in Nasirabad, her teachers had recommended the university in Peshawar. But she could never have stayed with Uncle Omar, who had no wife. In America, Shahid had declared he could keep a close eye on her. She could get her medical degree at a women's university and come home to attend to the women in Nasirabad who needed doctors, women who could not be seen by men. Baba had doubted there were such places in America, but Shahid was persuasive, and Afia's eyes shone. There were men on her campus, he knew, but the place was designed for women, sensitive to women. Afia would have been horrified by what went on at Enright during the weekends. She would have felt tainted. No, she would have been tainted. As it was, she'd returned home last summer the same innocent she had been when she went away. More and Baba, More is mom in Pashtun. More and Baba had been pleased beyond measure. They told Khalid so when he came down from the mountains and tried to persuade them to keep Afia home before Amrika stained her namus, her purity. This fall, when school had started up again, Shahid had felt easier in his heart, able to let her sister live her college life without checking up on her every other day. I hear you got a B+ on that Shakespeare paper, Coach was saying as she led the way into her office. Good job. He smiled sheepishly. Thanks to my sister. Afia? Coach's blonde eyebrows went up. Thought she was all about science. She's better at everything that's not a matter of hand-eye coordination. Don't put yourself down, Shahid. When you apply for that Harvard job, you'll be giving them a GPA that speaks for itself. Does Coach Bradley really think I'm qualified? I know he wants you. It's a question of the business school. You don't want to be a squash coach all your life. Well, I could be an AD like you. She ignored this. She knew him too well, better in some ways than either of his parents. She knew he couldn't care as she did about 20 or 30 young people at once. He cared deeply about a few. And he was too proud to be a great coach. So, Coach was saying, glancing over his itinerary, you missed the Tournament of Champions. Well, they'll survive. Her mouth, though, was tight. I'm sorry, Coach, but my parents. Don't worry about it. Let's look at the schedule for when you're back. She turned to the wide screen on her desk. It was open to the website for Smith College. Why are you looking at my sister's school? Shahid asked, surprised. Oh, that's Margot. She's lesbian, you know, and Enright's such a straight place. She's thinking of transferring, so we were looking it over together. Margot is, he started to say, shocked at the word lesbian, which he'd heard before, but never about an actual girl he knew. But then his eye followed the photos that drifted across the screen below the Smith College logo. Wait, Coach, he said as her hand went to her mouse. Shahid, it's not what you think. They're not all gay. I wouldn't have suggested you send Afia there if... Wait! He put his hand on her wrist. Look, he said. He pointed to the screen. A photo bloomed into being, a rally of some kind, and his sister. His sister! Her mouth open, shouting something, and her hand, holding another hand, definitely, yes. He sat clutching Coach's wrist while the photos looped through, and he could see it again, a big hand attached to a muscular arm, a man's hand. He slapped at the screen with the back of his hand. What the hell is this? He shouted. He stood up. His head felt full and tight. What is she doing? He looked at Coach, who had a strange, pale look. Shahid, calm down, she said. That's Afia, right? You're upset because... Turn it off! Turn the bloody thing off! She peered once more at the image as it loomed up, then closed down her browser. She stood to face him. She's at a rally. She said, there's nothing wrong. You've had your picture on the Enright site. She's not being inflammatory or anything if you want me to talk to her. It's not what she's doing, Coach. It's what she's holding. She frowned. She looked confused. 3 years now she'd been his coach. So long he'd almost forgotten how horrified he'd been when he first laid eyes on her. When he wrote home about life at Enright, he never mentioned having a female coach, much less a female AD. They would have thought him disrespected, or thought squash was not just unpopular in the States, but reviled. Even Uncle Omar, who'd spoken with Coach Hayes on the phone, thought she was an underling, and Shahid had never set him straight. But whenever Coach fixed him with her knowing eyes, Shahid couldn't imagine an authority greater than hers. She never barked like other coaches. She didn't need to. She went to the heart of the matter, whether it was the joint you'd smoked the night before or you're showing off for the girl in the third row. Even when you were at your worst, she would know at least one thing you were doing right. She never dissed your opponent. You've got his attention, she'd sometimes say. Now, earn his respect. Now, though, she was recoiling. Shahid, she said, you had a girlfriend last year. This has nothing to do with that. Do you not see? He waved at the blank computer screen as if the picture were still on it, his sister's hand in that paw. Shahid, you and Afia are in the States now. She wants to have a boyfriend. Does she? Does she have one? He was shouting at her now at his coach. Coach Khan had caned boys who shouted back. But only a flicker of something, disapproval, doubt, disturbed her gaze. Then she said, I don't know, Shahid. It's none of my business. I'm not sure it's yours. It is. I have to go, Coach. Stay, talk to me. But he couldn't. He let his itinerary float from Coach Hayes' desk to the floor, exited and hurried through the reception room. His breath whistled through clenched teeth. Outside in the bright December air, he pulled out his phone and fired off a text to Afia. What the fuck is up with that website pic? He couldn't think what else to write. A dull panic slowed his steps as he started across the quad to his history class. Afia was the flower in his heart. He might be the son who would find a place in the world of Western commerce, whose name might be in the newspapers, but she was the daughter who would bring good to the world. When they helped each other, Afia spent hours reading his assignments and helping him shape his words. He bought her boots with Uncle Omar's money. Who was this guy, creeping his fingers around her small hand? He'd kill this guy. Whatever infected Afia infected him. So Shahid's a little upset. And we'll leave him there. And I'll read you a section from Afia's point of view. And indeed, she was holding a guy's hand. His name is Gus. And I think that's all you really need to know for me to read you this next section. Gus's converted garage reminded Afia of the quarters occupied by Tayyab, the cook, back in Nasirabad. It was tucked the same way behind a hedge at the end of a driveway with a tiny nailed-up porch and a side door. Only Tayyab had a whole family in his quarters, separated by curtains for various privacies, while Gus's was one big room with a portable radiator cranking electric heat. They're like swimming jewels, she said of the fish in the big tank set up at the far end of the garage. She'd never known a person to keep tropical fish before. The snake and lizard, their cages by the adjacent wall, complete with heat lamps, reminded her of what anyone might see in the hotter area of her province, down by Peshawar. And the two cats reminded her of her village, where cats roamed free. Only these bright swimmers, some of them translucent, their eyes unblinking, mesmerized her. They have different behaviors, Gus said, standing close behind her, his hand on her shoulder. See how the betta come up to gulp air, and this little sucker mouth hides. See her behind the castle? You always say her. Yeah, they all seem like girls to me. I don't know why. In a week, she would leave for Nasirabad. Gus kept saying it was not a big deal, that he would miss her for the 3 weeks, sure, but he'd be busy with vet school applications and his own family in Pittsfield, and he would write her every day. She didn't know about getting email in her village, she'd reminded him. There was Alibi's, the internet cafe, but otherwise not much of a signal. Anyway, she'd said, I cannot be writing while I'm home. She wanted to say dangerous, but then he would ask how it could be dangerous, which was not possible to explain here. It's weird, she said. He'd seized on this information about an internet signal to calm her down. Not only, he pointed out, had the PR people at Smith cut him out of that picture, but there was also no way for anyone in her village to kick up a fuss about a web page they couldn't access. Oh, he made her brave, Gus did. He offered to talk to Shahid for her, which was not possible. Do you hear me? She insisted to him. Not possible. But with Gus in her heart, she felt able to make light of Shahid's acting like Baba, talking about her namus and the family's khairat, when it was just a photo after all, and she was doing nothing wrong in it. I don't even remember the guy, she'd lied in her last text to Shahid. Everyone was holding hands. She turned away from the fish tank to Gus's little stove, 2 burners below a microwave, where she was making him a special tikka, the first time she had cooked for him. She didn't like the yogurt she'd found for the marinade.
They were too thick, the yogurts in America, and they lacked the tang you needed for a good lassi. But she'd managed to find a heavy iron skillet at the Salvation Army, and they'd opened the high windows behind the stove to let the smoke escape. She knew from American TV how cooking was part of courtship in America. The men and women advanced their intimacy to where they were playing house, making the roles that would become tedious into moments of romance. Candles, a tiny white apron unveiled to reveal a clingy top, the masculine uncorking of wine. She and Shahid sometimes watched these shows broadcast from Peshawar, and Baba would come in and laugh at the man who thought his life would forever be this way, his perfumed lady staring longingly at him over roast chicken. "It is an illness they suffer from," he would say, "and when they recover, they find themselves married." She was ill, she supposed. Odd feelings came over her at unexpected moments. Sometimes it seemed her skin was not strong enough to contain the energy of her body. Other times her breath wouldn't come right, and then it was as if she didn't even need to breathe, as if her feelings for Gus drew oxygen from the air and charged her blood. He'd put on a song track they both liked, Rufus Wainwright, and fed the cats, and now he came to stand behind her. "Smells nice," he said, nuzzling her hair. "The tikka or my hair?" she asked, because she no longer covered now when she was alone with him, and her thick hair curled down her shoulders. He didn't answer, but wrapped his arms around her waist, and he moved with her as she chopped the onions and tasted the sauce. "Don't want to hold you and feel so helpless," he sang along with the song. "Don't want to smell you and lose my senses." The girls Afia lived with at Smith fell in and out of love with boys and with each other every day. They talked about birth control the way they talked about food, natural versus organic, controlling what they put in their bodies. When they could have been unlocking the secrets of proteins, they were weeping in the shower or giggling on the phone. It was, as Baba had said, a disease. But for her first 9 months in America, Afia had been immune. Even when she went to watch Shahid play, even when he introduced her to the guys on his team, she paid no attention to any of them, certainly not to the freckly redhead at the bottom of the lineup. Then in September, she'd gone to the med school fair at the State University with Taylor, who sometimes talked idly of becoming a pediatrician. 45 American med schools were there with their pamphlets and computer videos set up on plastic-covered folding tables, and 5 veterinary schools in a corner by the auditorium stage. When Taylor spotted Gus by himself at the table for Tufts, she gave a little squeal. "He's that cutie from your brother's team," she said. "Poor lonely boy, come on." He reminded her that day of the village boys, the way they could prattle about goats or the weather, but fell back to mumbling if asked about their sisters or their homes. Gus said he didn't have any sisters or brothers. He grimaced when Taylor called him a jock. "You can play squash by yourself," he said. That's how he'd started when he was a puny kid and didn't get picked for any high school teams. "You're not puny now," Taylor had said, and Afia had felt herself blushing because her eyes had fallen on his shoulders the way they pulled at his t-shirt. He was interested in endangered species, he'd said. He thought he might be a vet at a zoo or go somewhere exotic like Africa, only it was hard to get into vet school. Maybe he shouldn't play so much squash, Afia had suggested. He should be studying. That was not, he'd said, the advice her brother gave him when they roomed together. "When was that?" she asked, surprised, and he'd said that was all Shahid talked about that first year, getting his brilliant sister over here for school. "He missed you bad," he said, and Afia felt her face grow warm. I'm going to skip a little bit more about their relationship, which evolved over the months. Now, cooking in the garage, she shooed him away and flamed the tikka. The cats, Facebook and eBay he'd named them, meowed and rubbed at her legs even as smoke billowed up and drifted out the high windows. On her instructions, he ran the blender to make a version of lassi that wasn't the same as home but would have to do. They sat at his rickety folding table and ate. On the iPod, Rufus Wainwright crooned, "Every kind of love, or at least my kind of love, must be an imaginary love to start with." "Your mom taught you how to do all this, I bet," he said after he'd pronounced the food delicious and proved it by digging in. She was proud of her rice, fluffy and perfumed with clove and cardamom. "Some from her, yes. Mostly Tayyab, our cook." "Don't look so," she said when he rolled his eyes. "It's not like here. Servants..." People have servants. It's not just rich people, normal people. I know, Mafia. I'm just giving you a hard time. He called her that, Mafia, which he said was short for my Afia. What would be normal, he said, is sharing this great meal with your brother. I bet he misses this food. Don't, she warned him. She held up her fork and pointed it at him. I'm just saying he's my friend, too. He's my brother. I know him best. He nodded. She saw his eyes go to her white knuckles, clenching her fork. I'd like you to meet my family anyhow, he said, even if I can't meet yours. She wrinkled her brow. You have family? Sure. My mom. Sometimes my dad. They don't live together, but still. But that a mother did not make a family was not something she could tell Gus. It would hurt his feelings if he understood how many voices filled the compound in Nasirabad. But she will not like me, she said instead. She will think... She set down the food, drank her lassi. She was glad Gus didn't drink beer. In so many ways, he surprised her, always wanted to know what she thought about things. When she explained about the wedding, he saw nothing wrong in Mariam's being plighted to a man she had not met. He cried at sad movies. But still, his mother. She'll think I'm a bad girl. She'll be crazy about you. No, She couldn't finish. A tear welled in one eye. She tucked a finger under her glasses to wipe it away. A mother would want to inspect a girl first for her son. This, she knew, was universal, no matter what they showed on American TV. A mother would want to see how modest the girl was, how graceful. She would want to know something of the family. Such was a mother's absolute right. I'm not ready, she managed to say. Mafia, I've upset you. Come here. Come on. I'm sorry. It was infecting her, this illness, and all she could do was open her arms wide and invite it in. So that's Afia. For the squash players in the crowd and the rest of us, I will skip ahead. I'm sort of reading a little out of sequence here to read a scene of the squash team, which is playing Harvard. And there are some people here who know what it means to play Harvard. And there's been a bet laid by the chairman of the Board of Trustees, whose name is Horton. He's laid it with Don Shears, who's the president of the college, that if the squash team can beat Harvard, he will fund a new fitness center for the college, which otherwise he thinks is a stupid thing to do because he thinks more money should go to the football team instead. And that's been the general debate at the administration of Enright University. The other characters that you need to know about are just, there are some other names. You've heard of Chander already. Jamil, Chander, Gus, Yannick are all squash players. Ethan is Lissy Hayes' the coach's husband. Chloe is her daughter. Okay, so they're up playing Harvard. At the first break, all of Lissy's starters except Shahid were down. Worse, the Harvard supporters had begun their catcalling. Near Jamil, they riffed, "Hey, the Rastaman, he got joint account in the bank, he bring their spliff there, man," while Jamil hung his head and sucked on his water. In front of Afran, they minced with towels on their heads. "Call them off, goddammit," Lissy said to Bradley. "You think they listen to me?" Bradley said, but he hustled the towel wearers out of the area. Lissy went down the line, encouraging her players. Shahid should keep hammering his big serve. Afran needed to start nicking. Jamil could wear his guy down with lobs. Yannick, who'd lost a first-game squeaker at 14-12, should keep up the straight drives, just tighter and faster. She saw Gus, his casted leg thrust out in front. Oh, I should pause to say that Gus has had a car accident under somewhat mysterious circumstances, and his leg is broken, so he's not playing. His casted leg thrust out in front, sitting with Chander, giving him a pep talk. Keep them focused on the game, not on the outcome. That was the mandate. As they went back out, she prowled the aisle in front of the glass cages. Chander and Afran began fighting back, while Shahid took apart his opponent's game with the methodical logic of a surgeon. The razzing from Harvard supporters grew louder. The Enright crowd tried razzing back, but as Yannick flailed and Jamil missed shot after shot, they grew silent and sullen, like peasants Lissy thought, at a contest with the lords of the manor. In the middle of the stands, Shears and Horton were engaged in an animated debate, paying no attention to the action on the courts. From the top of the stands, Ethan gave her a thumbs up. On his left stood a spectator she hadn't seen before, a lithe man in dark fleece and pressed jeans who was cheering for neither Harvard nor Enright. She thought he looked like Shahid, then berated herself for thinking like Horton and the Harvard crowd, as if all dark, brown, lean men were related to each other. On the courts, something was shifting. Yannick and Jamil lost their second games quickly, but Chander and Afran were trading points with their opponents. Shahid had risen to 10-6 amid squabbles about lets. The Singaporean kid was casting looks out at his supporters, cocking his head toward Shahid as if to say, "Can you believe this raghead?" The match began to tip the other way. 7-10, 8-10, 9-10, 10-9. Oh, it's 9-10, 10 all, 11-10. Suddenly, Shahid's opponent stretched up for an impossible volley and cracked it across the side and front walls into the nick, and the second game was over. Playing to best of 5, the top 5 matches now stood at 2-0 Harvard for Yannick and Jamil, but 1 apiece for the other 3. As soon as Shahid was off the court and drinking water, Lissy pulled him aside. They huddled close together on the bench. Shahid was dripping sweat. "Just stay calm," she told him. "Keep steady, you've got him." "He's calling me names," Shahid said between clenched teeth. "Chinese, you know they hate us. Singapore Chinese especially. Pakistanis are dirt to them." "We call that bigotry, Shahid. Ignore it." "I could kill him, barehanded I could." "Beat him, Shahid. Just beat him, 1 point at a time." Lissy sat back. She didn't like the way she was talking. She never told her players to beat anyone. She told them to do their best, to live in the moment, to gain respect. Only the tide was turning. She could feel it, and Shahid was at the tip of the wave. She gripped his sweaty shoulder. "Do not retaliate," she said in a low voice. "Just beat him." When she stood up, she saw Afran exiting his court, beaming. Less than a minute later, Chander came off and high-fived his teammates. Both those matches now stood at 2-1 Enright. Lissy spoke with Afran, then stood back and let the 6 who had finished move in, joking to ease the tension. The Harvard crowd had quieted. Lissy stepped over to crouch next to Chander. From the corner of her eye, she saw Gus hobbling to the other end of the row of glass courts where Shahid was going back on. "I think I've got him," Chander said. "He can handle my slice, but when I follow up on that side, he's wrong-footed. I got 5 points that way." "Great, but don't count on one shot. Play a series. Use the whole court." Where's Shahid at?" "Way up. Now keep the pressure on." Shahid was bouncing the ball, preparing to serve, white-hot with anger. Instinctively, Lissy glanced toward the bleachers. In previous matches, opposing teams had unfurled banners with slogans like "Smoke the Camels," but she saw only a tense, buzzing crowd. Horton and Shears were deep in conversation. Ethan, with Chloe in his lap, was still on the top row. The dark stranger stood next to them, holding his chin in his palm. Something hostile in the guy's stance. Who was he? She waved at Chloe and turned back to the court. Shahid was playing a laser-sharp game. He feathered the ball into the corners, attacked from the back wall. His face wore the mask of a vengeful god. And still, the score climbed toward Harvard. 3-2, 3-3, 4-3, 4-4, 4-5, 4-6, 4-7. I should stop for a moment and say that the mascot of the Enright team is Rockwell, after Norman Rockwell, which is in western Massachusetts, which will make the next paragraph be a little clearer. Behind her, the Enright crowd bloomed into life. We will, Rockwell," the students began shouting, as Chander took a quick lead in his 4th game. Afran clawed back from 3-7 to 9-7 in his 3rd. George Bradley was pacing before the court, stopping to plant his hands on his hips, his face grimly set. A strange calm took hold of Lissy. She'd felt it before, this slowing of time, this rebalancing of sound. The cheers and jeers of the crowd receded. The footfalls and hot breaths of the players echoed in her ears. She had felt it at the British Open when she reached the round of 16. She had known the same feeling just once before as a coach at Rutgers when the smallest and bravest of her tennis players fought her way into a third set as the sun slowly sank and went down in the tiebreaker. The feeling was like a dream of flying where the destination doesn't matter, only the need to remain aloft. And so she forgot about the fitness center. She forgot about Afia. Only these young men mattered. And then Chander won the fourth game, countering Yannick's 1-3 loss and bringing the team score to 4-2 and right. And I'll leave you to find out what happens to that game when you read the book. I will end with another scene set back in Pakistan. And this is at Mariam's wedding, where we are looking at things from Afia's point of view. And I want to leave time for questions, so I think I'll just begin this. We're in a huge banquet hall filled with women. The men are somewhere else in the facility, except for a few young men who come to kind of spy on the unmarried women at the wedding. But otherwise, it's a huge banquet hall filled with women, and the groom's family is waiting on a stage at the front of the banquet hall. And Mariam, the bride, has just appeared from the back of the banquet hall on the arm of her brother. She was, Afia thought, she's referring to Mariam, she was a work of art. A red veil edged with a broad swath of gold and green embroidery, studded with mirrors and bits of colored glass, fell from the crown of her head over her shoulders, leaving her face exposed. From the top hung a diadem of ruby and gold in the center of her forehead, echoed by the heavy necklace that lay across her collarbone above the tight embroidered bodice of her ruby red gown. Her face looked not beautiful, but majestic, with the deep kohl around her eyes and several pairs of false lashes, her cheeks both whitened and rouged at the bones, her small mouth stained red, almost in the shape of a heart. Holding fast to her brother, she took a step forward. Then the lights went out. The women groaned. "Load shedding," said Murray. "What a moment for it." "Poor girl," said one of the aunts. Afia sat in the dark. She had forgotten how it was always like this, the electricity going out at a moment's notice, the air dark and still and hot. She felt the anticipation in the room like that uncanny moment when the airplane leaves the tarmac, defying gravity. This was the journey, all the women were saying together. These heavy, glittering garments, this gold against the throat, this man waiting on a white couch. As soon as the lights came back on, they would have liftoff. What had Afia been thinking, off in that strange land, America? Had her brain gone upside down, that she should think of men and women like stray planets drawn to each other and not like stars in a constellation of family? Around her, the women buzzed. Sobia and Muska, holding hands, went scuttling in the dark between tables headed for the trays of tiny cakes. Zardad, that was the name, whose parents would come to call in a few days. She would need to look rested, healthful, humble, helpful. Zardad. She tried saying the name silently with her teeth and tongue. Back toward her throat, another name lingered. Gus. The lights returned along with the distant roar of a generator. In the room's center, Mariam had not moved a muscle. Now she wobbled forward on her heels, her mouth frozen in a half curl. Ahead of her, on his makeshift throne, the groom appeared pleased. He had perhaps seen a picture of her, but her real self was an improvement. She was not an ugly girl, far from it. But he did not look at her really, nor she at him. Her brother sat Mariam on the couch, and she folded her henna'd hands in her lap, the hands they had all exclaimed over just yesterday when the transformation of Mariam into a bride had begun. However short her forehead, however clumsy her walk, Mariam was coming to her husband pure. Afia forced herself to study her cousin as she smiled for the cameras and nodded at the friends and relatives who approached the couch to give their blessings. Mariam's mouth, she thought, trembled a little. Her eyes, so prominent with the kohl and extra lashes, betrayed eagerness, hope, anxiety, excitement, and terror. Tonight, this girl who had not been kissed, who had not been touched, would go with her strange new husband to his parents' house, where he would undress her and make love to her, perhaps gently, perhaps roughly. The next day, his family would celebrate the consummation, while her own retreated home and adjusted to life without their daughter. Afia had never dwelled on any of this before, not in such terms. Everyone knew what happened, but you didn't think about it, and she wouldn't think about it. Not now. And that's all I'll read for now. But I'm really happy to take your questions. I should give all credit, by the way, to Coach Asayante, who corrected all my errors on the squash scene. And if anything's wrong there, you talk to him. Other questions? Like, where did I get the mistakes in the squash scene? That was Coach. Yeah.
So you said you traveled to Pakistan to do research? What kind of research did you do in Pakistan?
I stayed with families, one family in Lahore and the other in Peshawar, which is just the other side of the Khyber Pass from Afghanistan. People here had never heard of Peshawar until 149 school children were killed there last December. And so I lived with these families for a short period of time, and particularly in Lahore, I was mostly talking to journalists and human rights advocates. But in Peshawar, I spent time in the villages around Peshawar, and I spoke to young people, a lot of young people, about their feelings about relationships, marriage, arranged marriage. Marriages are universally arranged in that part of the world, and that sort of thing. And I also talked to village parents and got their feelings about their children and whether they would let their children come over to the United States and what their expectations were. So I was really just talking to people. Before I went over, I had read probably 40 books on Islam, Pakistan, the division between the history of Pakistan and India and the division there, and on the Pashtun culture and Pashtunwali, which is a kind of code of honor for the Pashtun culture. I did make a limited effort to learn Pashto, but I gave up on that very quickly. So that was my research. Other questions? Yeah, Claire?
Why Pakistan if you were going to, do this with...
Why
Pakistan? There are other, obviously, places to study Islam.
This is. I wasn't interested in Islam, and I really don't know that it has much to do with Islam. It has a lot more to do with the Pashtun culture than it does with Islam, because the Pashtun culture and Pashtunwali predate Islam, and since things about honor were there in place long before Islam came along. But it was a simple thing. Where do the best squash players in the world come from? They come from the Pashtun area of Pakistan. And I didn't have to have my squash player come from the place where the best squash players in the world come from, but it was sort of a starting point. And that's also where the Taliban come from. So it seemed to me it would be a pretty interesting change. And that was where that began. Yeah. Yeah.
Obviously you did your research and read several books before actually going over to Pakistan to meet with these people. was there anything that you learned in talking to them that you would not have encountered in the book, or any expectations that were completely shattered despite having done a lot of reading on your own?
I would say almost everything. I mean, that is, there's this big question that we have in the West when we hear about honor violence, which is, what befalls women and girls when they stray from a code of honor where the honor of the family basically lies with women, and in a particular part of women's anatomy. And you think, how could this happen? How can a loving, families are loving all over the world, and how can it happen that a loving family would exert violence in this way? And no matter how many books I read, they did not give me a sense of how that could come about, except by sort of having like mustachioed evil people on the other side of the equation, and I knew that wasn't true. So going over there gave me a sense of an entire culture where so many things that we take for granted were absolutely alien. I mean, just to give you a tiny example, people felt sorry for me. Many people I met felt quite sorry for me. And why would they feel sorry for me? Because the first thing they asked me was whether I had children. And I told them, yes, I have 2 sons. And, well, where were my sons? Did they live with me? No, they don't live with me. Oh, that's sad to begin with. Then, well, where was my husband? Well, I didn't have a husband. I was at that time a single parent. Well, were we all living with my parents then? No, well, we weren't living with my parents. Well, where were their uncles? And I thought, damn it, where were their uncles, but they thought that was just the worst fate that could befall a person. It was just unimaginable. So you realize how very different this is, because I didn't think I was pitiable in any way. So it was not until I was there and spending, breaking bread with people and really talking that I got a much larger sense. Yeah.
Why did you choose the Berkshires?
I spend the summers there, and so I always like writing in an environment that that I can kind of feel the weather, for instance. I also, as the plot developed, and I can't really say whether I was stuck on the colleges being located in the Berkshires or not. It's just I was there, so it was there. But I ended up wanting a place that would be not too far from Smith College, and also not too far from the foothills of the Adirondacks, which actually play a small geographical role in the story. So at that point, having the college in the Berkshires became a pretty set thing. It's also, you can't kind of get more sort of Yankee than the Berkshires of Western Massachusetts, and I wanted that contrast. Set it in New York or somewhere, you'd have a lot more international students around. Aren't a lot of international students at a college in the Berkshires.
I think we have time for one more question.
Ask me anything. Yeah.
Did you also research sort of honor in America? Because I know that sort of went on in the South a bit, or was it mostly just...
That's a good question. I actually have lived with honor in America most of my life, and that's one thing I didn't have to research because I know it pretty well. I grew up in St. Louis, which is sort of like the northernmost outpost of the South in a lot of ways. I've actually written a memoir about St. Louis, and issues of chivalry and that sort of thing are really important to a kind of Southern code that reaches as far north as St. Louis. The other way in which I've lived with questions of honor is that one of my sons was a nationally ranked athlete. So I spent a lot of time with coaches and with other parents of athletes. And the issues of what we call good sportsmanship are essentially issues of honor. And there's one thing I noticed about most of the coaches that my son dealt with, which was that they were all about honor and respect and good sportsmanship and just putting your best into it. And they cared deeply, deeply about their players and all their players' problems. There was only one thing that mattered more: winning. And that, to me, honor is always double-sided. And that, to me, was an interesting thing that I really lived with for at least a decade. So that sort of stuff I didn't have to research because it was already kind of part of my life and part of my thinking. Anybody else? All right, I'm going to sit over there and sign some books, and you can ask me questions there. Thanks a lot.